Great. So at this point, if you have come in with a prepared question, feel free to either ask it in group chat or try to get my attention in group chat so that I can unmute you and you can say it aloud for the group. And if multiple questions are coming in group chat, I'll do my best to take them in the order in which they showed up. So your first channel to get my attention is to type into the group chat, please. And the review session is now open. Okay, so I have a question from Matt. So if you're in the process of typing a question, please just hold off so that we can get things addressed here without too much overlap. So Matt is first to the floor, and Matt says, when you say using only its processing assumption, does that refer to the whole word criterion? So this is in reference to a part of the study guide in which, so I made some adjustments based on feedback I got in meetings on Thursday. I made some adjustments to what I am going to require from you, what you are obligated to know for the exam. And this does have to do with the whole word criterion to initiate articulation versus the initial phoneme criterion to initiate articulation. And the crux of the issue here is the ability for the two different models to account for the position of irregularity effect in word naming. And we initially said that the analogy model could not account for position of irregularity, whereas the dual root cascaded model could. And I sort of doubled back on that statement the end of Wednesday night, because it turns out if you are willing to relax your assumptions about initiating articulation, then you can account for position of regularity using either model. But I am not asking you to know that for the exam. If anything, there may be an extra credit question on the exam. So indeed, when I say using only the model's processing assumptions, I am saying let's retain the assumption for both of these models that to initiate the verbal response and to end the naming period, we must have activation cross-threshold for a phoneme in each position. And so we're not worrying about strategic response dynamics, and we're not worrying about aerodynamic principles of plosives or anything like that. We are saying, does what's going on in the model's quote-unquote head allow us to account for position of irregularity? So yes, Matt, you do have to retain the whole word criterion to answer the question as asked. So just to briefly recap, whereas because the analogy model, the processing, the stuff going on in its mind, as long as we're not extending it to simulate response behavior, because the stuff going on in its mind is purely parallel. And therefore, the difficulties in beginning to speak an exception word don't depend on where the irregular spelling to sound mapping is. That is, since you need all phonemes to cross threshold, where that phoneme is doesn't particularly matter since the processing is purely parallel. The analogy model does not account for position of irregularity using only its processing assumptions. Whereas DRC is expressly designed to account for position of irregularity using only its processing assumptions, in that the slow serial action of the rule root and its interactions with the parallel behavior of the lexical root can entirely account for why early irregular mappings will matter more than late irregular mappings. Okay. So before moving on from that, I guess, Matt, you can indicate whether that has satisfied your question. Okay. So let's open the queue back up then. If someone else had a question partly typed, or if someone wishes to be unmuted, please indicate now. So as per usual, this goes best if you bring me questions, because it is difficult for me to identify where the problem areas are. So, okay, I'm having difficulty in determining whether this is people not knowing how to type into the group chat, or actually not having questions. So just as a first pass, if you know that you have a question that you need addressed, can you now just briefly type me into group chat? Ah, there we go. You know what? Let's do that anyway, though. Okay, so as it stands, here is what we're going to do. I'm going to resolve Jenna's question. I'm going to resolve Vicky's question, and then I will ask Jocelyn, can't remember your last name, Jocelyn, not Josie, to expand on what her question is. Okay, so let's start with Jenna's question. The readings mentioned a third lexical semantic root. Do we have to know about this, or only the main two roots? You don't have to know about it in detail, but yes, you do have to know that it exists. And the lexical semantic root is part of one of the two main roots, actually. Oh, sorry, I have my participant list in the way here. Okay. So, oops, let me return focus to where it needs to be. So the lexical semantic root referred to in the readings is referring to this branch of the lexical root. So this branch, which you have activation going between the letter units and the orthographic word units. And as I said in class, that is just like an interactive activation model. And then I switched most of my focus in the lecture to talking about the relationship between the orthographic lexicon and the phonological lexicon. But I know I did mention, at least in the first half of the lecture on DRC, that you also can have activation spread between either of the lexicons and the semantic system. Now, I cautioned you, and there's the like big red thing with a slash in it, which that this was not implemented in the simulation, but in viewing dual root cascaded model as a general theory, this subroot is included, okay? And what it suggests is that once you have recognition processes operating over printed words, you can start to retrieve your sense of meaning from those printed words. And similarly, because this is bidirectional, once you have recognition processes operating for words as phonological entities, as units of sound, you can also begin to retrieve meaning information. And moreover, retrieving the meaning from print may help you, may provide another route for activating the phonological form, so that, you know, if you think about seeing the word, I don't know, monkey, yes, seeing, you know, as a string on the page, oh, I recognize that M-O-N-K-E-Y is a thing that I know, and I know that that is pronounced monkey. Having the image in your head of, right, that's the, you know, a family of primates in Africa and the Americas that have prehensile tails and like apes, and they're kind of cute and they swing around on trees, that might help you also to get to the sound form, in addition to just knowing the printed form. And that you have to know. I would be prepared to sketch this model, just as you had to sketch IA. That is a possible thing that I would ask you to be able to do. This subroot will be more prevalent when we talk about acquired dyslexia, which will be after the exam. Someone just joined with a hot mic. Please mute yourself. Please mute yourself. Your sound is coming through. It's going to get everything all messed up. Okay. So it's going to be more relevant when we talk about acquired dyslexias. However, for now, it's just important to know that that semantic subsystem in principle is there, although not part of the computational simulation. And it is just a fork of the lexical root. So it is part of this whole lexical root here. Okay, let me pull back up some of the windows that I threw away. Okay, so for Jenna, yes, the lexical semantic root is part of the lexical root, which is one of the two main roots. but you don't have to be able to tell me about specific activation spreading assumptions, because specific activation spreading assumptions have never been defined for the semantic features because they weren't actually included in the simulation, okay? So I have some more questions coming in. I'm gonna put a temporary moratorium on questions until I have. Oh, great! And Genesis, thanks. Okay, I was gonna ask if that was sufficient. Okay, good. So moratorium on questions until I've then resolved Vicky and Jocelyn. So for Vicky, can you go over the difference between the regularity effects, regularity and irregularity effects for both models? Absolutely. So here, there's two things really to address. One is sort of the main effect of regularity, and one is the interaction, where the interaction says that regularity effects should matter most for low frequency words. Okay. So the first thing to remember is that the main effect of regularity states that exception spellings will have longer naming times than regular spellings, or conversely, that regular spellings will have shorter naming times than exception spellings. We are talking about real words in this case as opposed to pseudo words, but we're talking about real words that either fit the spelling to sound correspondence rules or that are an exception to the spelling to sound correspondence rules. So again, to make that concrete, something like the word pent, P-E-N-T, follows the regular rules. Something like pint, P-I-N-T, is an exception word. And on balance, on average, you find shorter naming times for pent than for pint. Similarly for, let's say, chef versus shed, where there's an irregular spelling in position 1, okay, for chef as opposed to shed. So the explanations in the two systems are different. The explanations for these regularity effects are different. So if we turn our attention now, well, you know what? While I already have the DRC slides up, I'm going to speak to this from the perspective of the DRC first, just to get us used to, I mean, you can go in either order. So rather than getting us fixed on a particular script, I'll take it in this order. So with the DRC, remember that words that the model knows are being recognized within these two lexicons. So we have local representation of words, one node, one word, but we have words as two different types of concepts in this model. We have words that are words in the sense of being printed objects, and we have words that are words in the sense of being spoken objects. And it has a lexicon for each, and this includes both regularly spelled words and exception words. Now, over on the rules side, what we have is a set of lookup tables and a processing module that sequentially, in order, operating from left to right, looks at each letter, checks the letter before to see if it's part of a complex grapheme, and either looks up the sound that matches the single letter or looks up the sound that matches the complex grapheme, and then begins recommending that down to the phoneme system and trying to activate the appropriate phoneme in the position according to the rule that it just computed. And remember that this rule system is slow in two respects. It is slow in that it is operating left to right rather than operating over all parts of the spelling simultaneously, which is what the lexical system does. It is also slow in that every time it discovers what the next rule is, it has to wait 17 loops through the simulation logic before it gets to actually apply that rule and begin activating the appropriate phoneme in the appropriate position. Now, moreover, regularity in this system is defined according to whether the rules can compute the correct pronunciation. So for an exception word, the lexical system, if it knows the exception word, will generate the correct pronunciation. It will be attempting to activate the correct phonemes at each position in the phoneme system. For a regular word, both systems will be attempting to activate the correct phonemes at the correct positions. But for an exception word, the rules will be attempting to activate at least one incorrect phoneme. So, for example, for chef, it will be attempting to activate initially a k in first position and later on a ch sound, as in chisel in first position. For pint, it will be attempting to activate an I in second position. The rule system will always get something wrong when computing over an exception word. Now, what happens when this system is attempting to activate one phoneme in a given position, and this rule system is attempting to activate a different phoneme in the same position? Well, what happens is, A, each phoneme is individually activating more slowly than it would be if both systems were trying to activate it, right? Because it's only getting, each one is only getting activation from one system. And moreover, those two phonemes in that position will undergo lateral inhibition with each other. So in order for one phoneme to win, it must have gotten a slight activation lead over the other, so that by lateral inhibition, it can eventually suppress that competitor, which will free it up to then leap up in activation and cross threshold. What that means is, whenever you have an exception spelling, wherever the irregular spelling to sound mapping will undergo competition as a consequence of the two roots trying to activate different phonemes. So if we go back to the example of pint, the lexical system will be trying to activate the long I in position 2, and the rule system will be trying to activate the I, the short I, in position 2. The correct exception phoneme will always win, and that's because the fast parallel activation spreading of the lexical system will always have started to boost the exception phoneme a little bit earlier than the rule system started to boost the regularized phoneme. But nonetheless, the fact that there will be some competition slows things down, as opposed to when these two systems are in complete agreement. So if we go to the example of pent, the lexical system is going to try and activate the the short E sound, in position 2. The rules system is going to try and activate the short E sound, in position 2. And that it's getting boosted from two sources, and it has no major competitor, which means, of course, it will cross threshold much, much faster than the long I sound in pint, right? And because the main effect of regularity, well, because naming time in both of these models requires that a phoneme at every position cross activation threshold, then if you have any slowdown in any phoneme crossing activation threshold, you have a slowdown in naming time. Okay. So with respect to the DRC, the penalty for exception words is a consequence of the conflict between the roots. Okay? It's a consequence of the conflict between the roots that they're making different, they're trying to activate two different phonemes in some position. So that's the first thing to understand. So Vicky, there's several things I want to address based on your question, but do we basically have that first chunk? Okay, so I'm not seeing anything, so I'm going to take that as a yes. While I still have DRC on the screen, let me then address the interaction of regularity with frequency. So when we consider the role of frequency, what we essentially find is that there isn't a penalty for high frequency exceptions. There is only a penalty for low frequency exception words. And we can account for that in this model because, just as in IA and just as in the analogy model, on the lexical side, the word recognition nodes are, they have resting levels based upon printed frequency in the orthographic lexicon and spoken frequency in the phonological lexicon. And higher frequency words have higher resting activation levels. And so for a word like, for example, have, I keep returning to, which is a very high frequency exception word, the reason that the rules won't contribute to a meaningful slowdown is that have, both the printed and spoken forms, are already at such a high resting level that as soon as they start to accumulate evidence, hey, I'm going to be the word, they can immediately pump their phonemes full of activation and get them across threshold before the rule system manages to catch up and make a conflicting recommendation. And so the fact that a high frequency word can juice up its phonemes so readily just means that the conflict doesn't have the opportunity to get going and be meaningful. But when it does have the opportunity to get going, then it slows things down. Okay. So then allow me to address these effects from the perspective of analogy. So remember, in the analogy model, we have only one system. We have the parallel activation spreading system, in which letters in particular positions spread activation and inhibition to word nodes, depending on whether they are consistent with them. And we just have the spelled word nodes. We don't make a distinction between spelled and spoken. And the word nodes spread activation and inhibition to phoneme nodes at the four positions, again, based on whether they are consistent or inconsistent with those phoneme nodes. And the question is, without a rules system, in what way does regularity matter? How can we explain the penalty for low frequency exception words. So the overall main effect penalty for exception words, and in particular when we're accounting for frequency, the penalty for those low frequency exception words. Well, we can account for them based upon the statistical distributions within the network of particular types of mappings. And this is why the canonical example is to look at the neighborhood of pint, hint, lint, and mint. You can find many other examples, but this one is nicely illustrative. And the reason is that they are all neighbors of each other in terms of spelling, but for the first letter. You have INT, 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 and INT, and we have overlapping mappings from these INT nodes and particular phoneme nodes, right? So all of these INT nodes are going to send activation to N in position 3 and to T in position 4. But moreover, and importantly for this effect, 3 out of the 4 are going to send activation to the short I sound in position 2. And only 1 out of the 4 is going to send activation to the long I sound. And remember that in this model, partial activation is very common, and cascading across levels is very common. So that while lateral inhibition happens, you're already getting multiple nodes contributing activation to the phonemes before you have one clear winner taking over the word level. And what that means is, in the case of hint, lint, and mint, not only is the target node sending activation to the ultimately correct phoneme, but it's got buddies that are partial fits to the underlying spelling, which are also sending their partial activation into the correct phoneme, the correct position 2 phoneme. But when the correct target is pint, it's the only thing sending any activation to I. When these things start out initially active, they're all sending their activation to I. And so it has to, over the long haul, get the long I sound across threshold all by itself. Whereas if we're talking about hint, lint, or mint, this thing got an initial boost from 3 things, and then its one target just has to get it across the finish line after its one lateral inhibition. This thing has to boost its phoneme all the way, all by itself. And so obviously it's going to take longer. And because the pronunciation isn't initiated until there's a phoneme active above threshold at all positions, this taking longer makes the naming response take longer. Now we can go back to the same example for why for high frequency words it's not going to matter. And we can think about have. What things are in the neighborhood of have? Save, rave, wave, right? Let's just say that. Save, rave, wave. Yes, all of those spelled neighbors are going to be trying to activate the long A sound. But what we're saying is that have is so much higher frequency than any of those that even though they have the advantage in numbers, it pushes the short A across threshold just on the basis of having started with such a head start in its resting activation. So being outnumbered makes a difference if you don't have a big frequency advantage. advantage. But if you have a big frequency advantage, that resting level advantage can overwhelm the advantage in numbers. Okay, I'm trying to find my chat controls here. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm going to consider Vicky's question done just because I haven't heard from her, and that was a big chunk of time. Oh, okay, follow-up. So when DRC sees a word, does it process on both sides? Yes. So both sides always start operating over any letter string that is presented to the visual feature nodes. Yes. So once the letter nodes start taking up activation, they are in parallel spreading activation to the orthographic lexicon on the lexical side and spreading activation into the rules module on the GPC side. Yes. So both things are always contributing. It doesn't really matter so much that both things are contributing, except when the systems are going to be in disagreement. And when are they going to be in disagreement? When the word is an exception word. Okay, so we have Jocelyn's question. I'm having a hard time understanding how fast regularization of low frequency exceptions are named faster than correct words. Yes, that is because I made an executive decision not to go over it because it can become an involved explanation. And it's not that I wouldn't like you to understand it, I would, and that's why I'm strongly considering including an extra credit question to this effect. Now the difficulty here is because this is a group exam review and I've made the decision that it's not required material, I feel like I can't take a lot of time to speak to that question in this forum. We can talk offline about that by email or in office hours, but let me leave you, Jocelyn, with this hint. It's related to the same sorts of gang effects that are involved in the main effect of regularity. You have to think about how lateral inhibition works and draw yourself some possible activation curves. And what you want to do is see if you can figure out for yourself how you would get an activation curve where the long I sound in pint, I'm so sorry, that's wrong. Where the short I sound in pint, the regularized pint, would have a very steep initial activation and then would fall off as it was being overtaken by the long I sound in pint. And you can sort of figure out how the analogy model might be used to explain that. But again, I'm leaving that as gravy now. Okay. So Isabella jumped in with a new question. Could we go over the competition that occurs between GPC and lexical root and how the position of the exception phoneme plays a role in naming time? So, okay, I'm going to assume, I don't know who's been jumping in and out. I just gave a really exhausting explanation of two interactions. And so I'm hoping I don't have to retread that in its entirety because many of the people who are here just heard that, but I did not specify position of irregularity. So I will extend my remarks to cover position of irregularity. So here we go. So as I was just saying, recall that the rule system is, if we're viewing an exception word, right? If we're viewing an exception word, the rule system is guaranteed to compute an incorrect pronunciation. That, for all intents and purposes, with respect to this system, is exactly how regularity versus exceptionality are defined. So the rule system know how to compute the pronunciations of regular spelling to sound mappings. Whereas the lexical system activates phonemes by position according to which phonemes are consistent with the winning phonological word node, assuming there is one. So it's assembling pronunciation via recognized words, okay? So that means we're going to assume that the irregularity is in some position. So let's go back to the example of chef, where the irregularity is in position 1. And let's, for the moment, let's skip over the fact that it's also a complex grapheme, which complicates the issue a little bit. Let's not worry about the fact that the rules will initially think it should be pronounced with a k. And even if we just think about the rules recommending that chef be pronounced chef, right? So the rules cannot compute the pronunciation chef with the esh sound. They will recommend the ch sound instead, the normal ch sound. Obviously, there's going to be some slowdown at phoneme position 1 because the lexical system will be passing activation via recognition into the correct esh node in position 1. The rule system, which will take some time to compute that mapping, will then come in slightly behind the lexical recognition system and start trying to pass activation into the ch sound in position 1. And because you don't have the esh taking activation from both roots, and furthermore, because the esh sound is receiving lateral inhibition competition from the ch sound, it will take longer to reach threshold than it would if the word had been shed, right? So that's just the normal effect of regularity. But why does positionality matter? It matters because this rule system, remember, reads completely left to right, and it has that built-in 17 simulation cycle delay every time it applies the rule to the next symbol that it's looking at in the next position. Whereas the lexical system is operating over the entirety of the spelling to sound mapping simultaneously. Once there is a winning node, assuming there is a winning node coming to activation in the phonological output lexicon, it's contributing activation to all 4 phonemes, not just 4, to all phonemes in all positions, all the relevant positions, simultaneously. And activation accrues over time, meaning that the more time that a given phoneme has been receiving activation from some sender node, then the better a position, the higher up, closer to threshold it already is, right? So that means if we now consider pint versus chef, pint, this system has already had to wait 17 cycles and then apply the rule for P equals P, and then wait 17 cycles and then apply the rule that I equals I, and then it starts to sneak some activation into I in position 2. Meanwhile, here, as soon as the pint word node, phonological word node, was active, it started activating P, I, N, and T simultaneously. And so the I node has been rising in activation for quite some time before this thing got around to computing the I equals I mapping, okay? Now it gets even more pronounced if we think of a word like steak, because now the rule system has waited 17 cycles and applied its S equals rule, waited 17 cycles and applied its T equals T rule, waited 17 cycles and applied its EA equals A rule. And again, we're sort of glossing over that it's even more complicated because that's a complex grapheme. But at the very least, it's gone through, 60 minus 9, about 51 cycles before it can even start pumping activation into the incorrect regularized phoneme in position 3, whereas by that time, the correct exception phoneme has probably been receiving activation from the phonological lexicon for several simulation cycles and is already so far ahead that the ability of the incorrect regularized phoneme to compete is really minimal. So this all sort of hinges on the understanding that the farther ahead a phoneme in a position is in activation, when a competitor starts coming to activation, the less that competitor will matter, because the ability of one phoneme to laterally inhibit others is partly a consequence of how active it is, right? So if it's already very active, then it can just immediately quiet down a new competitor that suddenly tries to come in. So the earlier that this rule system can get to recommending a conflicting phoneme, the more relevant that conflicting phoneme is in the overall slowdown of naming, okay? So, would the competition for phoneme in second position delay time as well? Yes, it would, but less so. So they, and by they, I mean Coulthard and Rassel, are treating this position of irregularity curve as being a genuinely graded effect. We discussed in class how that might not be, but I also told you not to worry about that for the exam in one of my assignments. So they're treating this as a genuinely graded effect. So this is just in DRC a consequence of how much further ahead a node that had the support of the recognition system was before the conflicting recommendation came in from the rule system. Yeah. Okay, you're welcome. All right, so that means that the queue is open for questions. And if it's easier to ask verbally, simply request an unmute, and I will do that. So as far as I'm aware, questions on deck have been cleared. So first person to get one into group chat gets their question answered next. We have several lurkers. There we go. Josie, can we go over which assumptions in the DRC model explain our ability to read pseudo words? Yes, we can. So actually, with respect to the DRC model, that's got a really easy answer. The much more complicated answer is with the analogy model. So with respect to the DRC model, our ability to read pseudo words is, sorry, I've got windows all over the place. Yes, I will do that since that's the harder answer. So with respect to the DRC model, it is explained via the existence of the rules. So because the whole point of the rules is to make local computations based on letters or graphemes that are sets of 2 letters, rather than looking at the whole word, right? It just takes letters or groups of 2 letters and maps them into recommendations for phonemes. That is what the GPC is there to do. And that means that if you have a string of letters which doesn't actually correspond to a known word in the model's lexicon, it doesn't really matter because, I mean, that doesn't prevent the rules from operating locally. Even though there's nothing globally that the lexical system can do because it doesn't know the word, the rules can still look at any string of letters and go, that's a P, and there's no H following it, puh, you know, right? That's an I, and there's no E following it, eh. Oh, by the way, I'm just realizing, and for the benefit of people watching this in the future on recording, shaking their fists at the screen in case I confused anyone, when this system sees STEAK, I think I misspoke earlier, it will recommend E in 3rd position, which is obviously wrong. And it'll be this system which is recommending the A in steak. So yeah, so it's the GPC that reads pseudo words. It's the GPC that reads pseudo words. I'm trying to think if there was one other concept I wanted to touch on before switching to analogy. I guess not. So the question then becomes, if you don't explicitly have rules that are working sort of locally, if everything you have goes through a global word recognition system, then how can you assemble the pronunciation for a letter string you've never seen before? Oh, I know what I was going to say. Is sort of implicit in all of this is that when people read pseudo words, they read them as regular as though they were regular words, obviously. And of course, that has to be it because it doesn't correspond to anything they know, so they can't have a memorized exception pronunciation, right? So it makes sense that when human beings see a pseudo word, all they can do is apply their understanding of how that string would be pronounced if it was a regular word. So in the context of the DRC model, it applies its rules. So in the context of the analogy model, it doesn't have lookup tables with computational rules. And as we mentioned in class, it also does not have direct connections between letter nodes and phoneme nodes. Everything is being mediated through word nodes. But again, just as we invoke to explain regularity effects in the analogy model, it is very important that partial activation happens and cascaded activation happens, where partially activated word nodes are allowed to partially activate phoneme nodes. You know, they don't have to be way ahead and winning some race and being close to ceiling before they're allowed to activate phoneme nodes. And even in situations where there is a clear best winner that gets sort of shaken out at the word level via lateral inhibition, lots of word nodes can be contributing activation to the phoneme level before that happens. Now, in the case of pseudo words, we have to accept that there will be no single best fit word node. So here I can try my fancy toy here if I remember how this works. When I'm sharing the screen, oh, I think I have to stop sharing the screen and then I can, hang on. I'm still here, everyone. I'm just switching up what I'm doing, but now, before it was giving me a whiteboard that I could pull up. And it changed the interface on me when people started doing video. No. Why does the interface look different than it did before? There we go. Woohoo! Okay. So, remember that if this is activation and this is time, that when there is a best fit word node, so let's say that we're particularly interested in word activation. So in the situation that there is a best fit node, you will sort of initially have this situation where there's a cohort of things active, and then most things in the cohort crash and burn, and the best fit just wins out, right? But when there's no best fit node, you just have a cohort that all kind of wins. And that means that they're all kind of passing their activation forward to the word level. Okay. Now, the important thing is the cohort of words that is partially fitting a spelling string, the phonemes that they will want to activate is not random. It implicitly encapsulates a set of regular spelling rules, even though those have not been specifically defined anywhere in the network. Okay. So if we were to show this network, and let's just use the neighborhood that's already on the screen, right? A spelling string, I'm looking at my keyboard here for inspiration. Let's say vint with a V. I don't believe that's a real word. I believe that's a pseudo word. So if we were to show the network vint with a V, well, just as we get regularity effects because hint, lint, and mint all sort of want to activate a common set of phonemes, we're going to get that with vint as well. So you have pint in there trying to muck things up with its long I sound, but you have three of these things all trying to activate the short I, and their collective activation will be sufficient to activate the short I. The collective activation of all four will be sufficient to activate the third N. The collective activation of all four will be sufficient to activate fourth position T. And then you would have to look at another neighborhood to get the V sound, because none of these things agree now on what initial phoneme to activate. They're just going to give a little weak activation to P, H, M, and L, but you're going to have a whole other neighborhood of words like vase, vice, vein, where they're all fitting that initial spelling of V, and they are all converging their activation onto an initial phoneme that is a V sound. And so when you take those two neighborhoods together, the neighborhood of the rhyme and the neighborhood of the initial phoneme, they assemble the correct activation at the phoneme level, even though that was assembled based on a bunch of moderately activated stuff at the word level, all working together. And so you will get the pronunciation vint. Okay, so unless there's follow-up on that, which there may be, then I would consider the queue to be open once more. What is a double filter? This is from Joel. What is a double filter and what model does it apply to? Joel, double filter is a descriptive term which I, Peter Krause, use when trying to explain certain things that happen in the dual root cascaded model. This is not official terminology. So it applies to dual root cascaded. The concept that I am attempting to illustrate when I use that term is why in the DRC you tend to have either one winning phonological node in the, one winning word node in the phonological lexicon, or basically absolute quiet in the phonological lexicon. Those are basically the two possibilities. Now, This is very different than what happens in the analogy model, where you tend to have groups of moderately activated words at various times in the word level, right? That's essential to the analogy model's ability to show regularity effects and to pronounce pseudo words. That doesn't happen in DRC. And there's a few reasons that it doesn't happen. The main reason is, although you might get some initial groups of words activating in the orthographic lexicon, that tendency is already diminished here because of very strong lateral inhibition in comparison to the analogy model. But the other issue is, for simplicity's sake, we often, when describing these two models, just talk as though, hey, an excitatory connection is an excitatory connection, and an inhibitory connection is an inhibitory connection. That simplifies the issue somewhat, because as we learned when I was very first lecturing on neural nets as a general concept, connection weights can take on any positive or negative numeric value. And the specific positive or negative numeric value you set has very important implications, because the activation that shows up in a node here is a consequence of two things: the activation of any sending nodes and the weights on the intervening connections, because it's a multiplication problem. Now, it turns out, in addition to having strong lateral inhibition in the orthographic lexicon, the excitatory connections running here are weak. That is to say that the specific numeric multiplier values on these connections are of a very low magnitude. They're close to zero. They're a little bit above zero, okay? What that means is moderately activated nodes in this orthographic lexicon don't end up supplying much activation to word nodes here. So that's different. Where in the analogy model, cascading activation, the fact that if I am partially active, I get to send lots of influence to things that are connected to me. That's important in the analogy model. It doesn't happen here. By setting these connections weak, it means that we filter out activation that is moderately strong here and make it extremely weak here. Only large activation values here manage to start juicing up nodes in this lexicon. And as a consequence, since there is at best, there's always at most one node that is really strongly active, right? You either have a group of moderately active nodes or you have one node that is really strongly active. It is that one node that is really strongly active that will manage to meaningfully activate a node in this lexicon. If you don't have one node that is really strongly active here, then you end up with basically piddling little bits of activation that don't matter down in the phonological lexicon. So what has happened then is you've strongly filtered, via weak connections, strongly filtered the activation of the word nodes. And the action of the word nodes via lateral inhibition is already filtering the activation being contributed by the letter units. So that's what I mean, that by the time you get here, you've been double filtered in terms of you're so far removed from the letter units. And even though there may be spelled words that are sort of in the vicinity of a spelled string, if there's nothing that matches, you don't have any activation going on in the phonological lexicon. This is why the lexical root alone can't name pseudo words in DRC. You need the rules to do it instead. So again, we have a follow-up or new question. Okay, great. So Joel says that makes sense. So floor is open for other questions. And let's see how we're doing on time. So 2:14, there's still 11 people here, so, or still 10 besides me. So I had sort of hedged on whether we were going to go to 2:30 or 3. If you want me to go to 3, we need to start getting some questions in the pipeline. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that we're winding down. All right, so I don't want to call on people individually. And I know sometimes you just show up and think, oh, productive things will happen, even if you don't have a particular plan. But I see at least 3, maybe 4 people who haven't asked a question. Yeah, I don't have it memorized, Cynthia. So, well, let me see if I have it here. Let's see. I'm in Canvas here, actually. Give me a sec. Assignments. Okay, so 3 on the homework says, imagine you could turn off the entire lexical root. Well, that's not what I have. You say rule root. I have lexical root. So which one do you want, Cynthia? Number 3 or number 4, which is a higher priority? Okay, so if we could turn off, no worries. Suddenly I was confused. So imagine we could turn off the entire lexical root in the DRC. And then think about what would happen if you showed this modified DRC an exception word. Okay, so I've talked about some of these principles a few times since I've been online. And so I'm going to turn it back around on group chat, actually, because I'm going to ask a couple of questions that just weren't one-word answers, okay? So which of the 2 roots can correctly read an exception word? Okay. I have 2 people voting for GPC. Do I have any other votes? So I think that there's an important bit of interference that's happening here, and I completely understand it. But it is an important distinction. Remember that exception words and pseudo words aren't the same thing. And yeah, So it's actually the lexical root is the only root that can read exception words. The GPC root is the only root that can read pseudo words. So yes, they actually each have one thing that only they can do. So be careful that you're not just automatically going to, oh, I know there's the GPC is the only root that can do something the lexical root can't do. That's true, but it's specifically pseudo words. What the lexical root can do that the GPC can't do is read exception words, and that's critical to these two questions and very likely to the exam as well. So the GPC, because it reads, yes, Josie, we can. So yeah, I guess I would have to, or moving forward wouldn't make sense. So, okay. An exception word is a real word that is in a typical adult expert reader's lexicon. A regular word is also a real word that is in a typical adult expert reader's lexicon. A pseudo word refers to a printed string which does not map onto a real word that we would expect an expert reader to know. But what makes an exception word different from a regular word is that it violates typical spelling to sound mappings. So an exception word is like pint, wand, chef, or steak. Because we would expect those words on the basis of rule to be pronounced pint, wand, chef, or steak. They are, however, words. Pint is an English unit of measure. Wand is like a stick and oftentimes, involved in arcana and the occult. And chef is, someone who cooks nice food, and steak is a slab of meat. So a pseudo word is a letter string which is pronounceable according to the rules, but which does not refer to a word in use that an expert reader would actually have seen before. So munt, M-U-N-T, pronounceable, clearly adjacent to things I know, like hunt or runt, but not an actual word. I couldn't tell you what it means. I couldn't use it in a sentence. Because pseudo words are pronounceable by rule, they are pronounceable by the GPC system of DRC. But because pseudo words are not words in the lexicon, they will not be included in the orthographic word nodes or the phonological word nodes of the DRC. And therefore, because of the weak activation spreading from the orthographic lexicon to the phonological lexicon, and the fact that there will be no real activation of any node in the phonological lexicon, if you show a pseudo word to DRC, the lexical root is making no contribution to the phonemes. If we turn that around and talk about an exception word, the whole notion of an exception word is that it is a word, and so it will be in this lexicon. And because it is in this lexicon, and the mappings from that node to the appropriate phoneme nodes are defined, then this system will start spreading activation to the correct phoneme nodes in each position. But because the spelling violates the pronunciation rules, when this local rule system goes and computes pronunciations based on one letter or a group of two letters, at least one of its recommended phonemes is guaranteed to be wrong. And this brings us at last back to number 3. If we disable the word recognition root and show the DRC an exception word is a word. An exception word is a word. So the role of the lexical root is to recognize that word and start activating the phonemes that go with that word, which it has memorized. This system just sees letters and ways of turning letters into sound, but the ways that it turns letters into sound are incorrect for exception words. So if we disable this system and show the model an exception word, what will happen? Well, the rule system will generate a pronunciation all by itself and activate that pronunciation in the phoneme system. So you'll still eventually get a pronunciation that crosses threshold, but here's the critical question for the homework. Will the pronunciation that the rule system generates all by itself for the exception word be right or wrong? That's a question for chat. If the GPC single-handedly, yes, exactly, Cynthia, it will be wrong. And there, plus some explanation of why, is your answer to number 3. Other questions? People are beginning to trickle out. Other questions? So because I'm not seeing huge continued demand, I am not planning to continue to 3 o'clock. Because I'm not seeing people join who weren't already here, jumping in at the last second saying, hey, I couldn't get here until now, which is what I thought might happen. So that being the case, say something, put something in chat now. We essentially have time for one more question before I call it here. Well, and then just as I was saying that no one knew was joining, Christian jumped in. So things have been winding down here, Christian, for context. It feels to me. But if you came in with a critical concern, then now is a good time to put your thoughts in order and either type that into the chat or indicate to me that you wish to ask a voice question, and I will unmute you. No, that's okay. I mean, there wasn't a time that fit everyone in the class. I wasn't expecting. That's cool, but I do. If you joined with a particular agenda, I do wish to at least speak to that agenda a little bit. So Cynthia says, do we need to know about the dynamic version of the analogy model? And I apologize if my phrasing on the study guide was unclear. That's the version we've been studying. So the only version that I've been lecturing on you on, and the version that I've been talking about over the course of today, is the dynamic analogy model. What you don't need to know is the static analogy model, which is discussed briefly in Kawamoto 1994, which was assigned reading, but which I have not discussed at any point in lecture. Okay, so 2-minute warning here. If I don't get a meaty question within the next 2 minutes, I'm going to call it and then work on getting the archive of the stream posted. And there was an immediate mass exodus. So, all right, to those who are remaining, you are about to be booted, but thanks for your attention, and I will see you on Wednesday.